All right, we have made it to our third unit of this semester. We have just finished up talking about the 19th century and the emergence of the short story genre as a whole. And just to kind of recap where we've been um, throughout our course so far, we've really looked at the origin stories and the oral tradition and how myths, parables, creation stories, fairy tales go from this, like I said, oral tradition to written form. And in our second unit, we discussed how those origin tales are turned into sketches, vignettes, with someone like Washington Irving, and stories focused on a singular event, this emphasis on romanticism and realism to naturalism, um, and this form that relies heavily on plot structure. But as we move into the 20th century, we leave behind some of these ideas that Irving, Hawthorne, Poe, Melville, the 19th century and forms that you guys are pretty familiar with. They make sense to you. But in the first half of the 20th century, the appeal of the short story really continues to grow. Hundreds of writers, including almost every major dramatist, poet, and novelist, published thousands of excellent short stories. And I think one of the things that appeals to um, people who, or especially these particular 20th century writers, the thing that appeals to them to try their hand at writing short stories is the level of difficulty that it presents because of the emphasis of economy of space, right? It's challenging to get a story across when you have to think about the limitations that the short story provides. But the other interesting thing that happens in the 20th century is that America really loses its foothold in the short story domination kind of field. If you remember, I said that the beginnings of the short story is predominantly American, and at the turn of the at the beginning of the 20th century, um, America is no longer the only uh, country, I guess, that's interested or takes an interest in producing and reading short stories. And when they lose that exclusivity, if you will, um, the familiarity of the genre increases, and as that familiarity increases, the short story form itself becomes more varied and complex, and the fundamental means of structuring a story undergoes a significant change. And part of that has to do with the overwhelming or unique event that usually informed the 19th century short story fell out of favor with the story writer. And what I mean by that is if you look back to all of the stories that we've read previously by Hawthorne, Irving, Poe, Glaspell, um, Gilman, all of the stories that we read in the past unit, their focus is on one particular event or one significant kind of moment in time. And they're forms that you are familiar with, right? That traditional plot structure, which I'm going to come back to. But that traditional formal storytelling falls out of favor. And in the 20th century, like I said, the early 20th century grows more interested in subtle actions and unspectacular events. There's this increased sensitivity to this increased sensitivity to and experimentation with form. And although popular writers of the century um, continue to structure stories according to plot, most artists turned elsewhere for structure, frequently eliciting the response from cursory readers that nothing happens in these stories. Narratives like Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, which we'll read this week, may seem to have no structure at all, so little physical action develops. But the stories that we'll be reading this unit are structured around a psychological rather than a physical conflict. Now, I know you're asking yourself, well, what caused all these changes? Why alter something that is so good? Well, part of the reason that all of these changes happen to the short story, it's a reflection of the changes of the era, of the changes of the day. This is really a transitional period from the 19th century to the 20th century, and there are, I mean, we'll talk about it in just a second, but it's a this change in the short story is a direct reflection or a direct result of a new social, cultural, and international movement that has been coined modernism. That's what we call it now. And if you're familiar with, I mean, and it doesn't, modernism doesn't just affect art or literature. It affected everything in the 20th century. But to make my point about how it affects the short story, take a look at this picture of by Pablo Picasso, right? And this is what I mean by we really get this experimentation with form and turning things upside down and making things different or not adhere to what would have been traditional ideas, right? And all of that can really be summed up in the kind of unofficial slogan of the modernist movement, make it new. And if you're familiar with Ezra Pound is the person who said, make it new. But make it new. And modernism really arises out of the rebellious mood at the beginning of the 20th century. It's a radical approach that yearned to revitalize the way modern civilization viewed life, art, politics, science, you name it. And this rebellious attitude that flourished between about 1900 to 1930 had at its basis the rejection of European culture for having become too corrupt, complacent, and lethargic, ailing because it was bound by the artificialities of society that was too preoccupied with image and too scared of change. So we get this real dissatisfaction with the moral bankruptcy of everything European that led modern thinkers and artists to explore other alternatives, especially primitive cultures, but also looking at things that would kind of upset the establishment. And this new emerging culture undermines tradition and authority in the hopes of transforming contemporary society. So, what does all of that mean? Essentially, at the heart of the modernist movement is this idea that things need to be questioned. Previously accepted means of the status quo, right, should be questioned and evaluated. And part of that is through experimentation and manipulation of form, and this realization that knowledge is not absolute. Some themes of the modernists, and we can find this in all of our stories for the unit, is the breakdown of social norms and cultural sureties. Nothing is guaranteed. And we also have this view of the dislocation of meaning and sense from its normal context, which we'll talk about. The valorization of the despairing individual in the face of an unmanageable future. And all of these kind of ideas reflect what I want to talk about in the kind of wake of World War One or the Great War. This idea of disillusionment, that society has lied to us. There is this kind of unsatisfaction with hypocrisy, or the what the world we thought was, or what things we thought were, are no longer. Our eyes are open, so to speak. A rejection of history and substitution of a mythical past. A product of metropolis, of cities and urbanscapes, which I'll talk about, and this idea of stream of consciousness, which we'll talk about next week. But our works for this unit really encompass these kind of ideas. I mean, they're not limited to these themes, but these are certainly modernist themes in addition to some of the other ones that we'll read for. Some characteristics that define the modernist movement and modernist literature is the rejection of religious and moral principles, or nihilism. Nihil means nothing in Latin, but with the modernist movement, and one of the defining characteristics associated with modernism is this rejection of moral principles as the only means of obtaining social progress. That doesn't necessarily mean that people stopped believing in God or stopped going to church, although a lot of people, a great majority of the modernist writers were atheists, but they saw social structures and religious structures, these institutions, as a way to enforce conformity on people. And this conformity, or this exertion of control, was a way to exert control over human feelings. In other words, the rules of conduct were a restrictive and limiting force over the human spirit. And the modernists believe that for an individual to feel whole and a contributor to the revitalization of social process, he or she needed to be free of the encumbering baggage of hundreds of years of hypocrisy that these institutions represent. Another defining characteristic of how the modernist movement came to be is new technological I lost my place. Scientific discoveries and technological innovations that were taking place around the world. The world was changing so quickly that culture had to redefine itself constantly in order to keep up the pace with modernity and not appear anachronistic. If you think about it, like, you've got all of these inventions that fundamentally change the way people live, happening all the time. And as soon as one kind of invention or theory was embraced, there'd be another one on the upstart. So the modernists felt a sense of constant anticipation and didn't want to commit to any one system that would thereby harness creativity and ultimately annihilate what they felt was their creative kind of powers. But another thing that is a characteristic of the modernist movement is this exploration of perversity and the primitive. And that comes from, in the 19th century, the Victorians were kind of a repressed society. And in order to be a part of civilized society, the people in the 19th century, they thought that they had to kind of repress the natural urges or desires that man or woman has. And taboo topics like adultery, sex, homosexuality, incest, all of those kind of taboo topics become an obsession for the modernists. And this obsession with the forbidden and the lurid was tantamount to rediscovery of passion, and they felt that this exploration of man's darker side in a way that hadn't been explored, because Hawthorne kind of explores the darker side of man, but in a religious kind of sinful context. But this exploration of man's primitive nature and the freedom to do so comes hand in hand with this rejection of religious conformity and things like that. So it becomes important for modernists to explore what's underneath the surface of man. And the best way to do that was to scrutinize a person's real aspirations, feelings, actions. What was in what the result of that is revealed this kind of new honesty in portrayal, disintegration, madness, suicide, sexual depravity, morbidity, deception. And while many would assail this portrayal as morally degenerate, modernists felt that they were just liberating themselves. So this modernist portrayal of human nature kind of leads to my next point about urbanization, and this exploration of or portrayal of human nature takes place within the context of the city rather than in nature, where we spend most of our time during the 19th century. Because at the beginning of the 19th century, the Romantics idealized nature as this kind of evidence of a transcendent existence of God. But towards the end of the century, nature becomes a symbol of chaotic, random existence. And for the modernists, nature is irrelevant and passé because the city supersedes nature as this life force. We have this shift in the interest from nature to the city because so many people leave the countryside at this time to make their fortunes in the city. This new I want to say it's like another industrial revolution where the city becomes a new capital of culture and technology, this kind of artificial paradise. But more importantly, the city is the place where man can be dehumanized by so many degenerate forces, and the city then becomes this locus where modern man is microscopically focused on and dissected. So the city then becomes this kind of cemetery for lost souls. So what causes, I promise I'm going to wrap this up really quickly, but the causes of the modernist movement, like I was just saying, the scientific and technological innovations that make them so wishy-washy to commit to any one thing. Discoveries like electricity, the combustion engine, the incandescent light bulb, the automobile, the airplane, radio, x-rays, fertilizers, you name it, revolutionized the world in really distinctive ways. It creates this optimistic aura of a worldly paradise, and new technology was a way to reshape man into moral perfection. But this new technology quickened the pace through which people experience life on a day-to-day basis. And a person could expand the scope of daily activities through the power of the machine. And that has an incredible impact on how people viewed the world around them. Another cause are psychological innovations with theorists, however you say that word, theorists is what I'm going to call them, fundamentally alter the way modern man viewed his own internal reality and this unexplored heart of darkness. And two of those leading figures were Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And for those of you who are, into psychology, you guys are all familiar with Freud and this desire to explain the internal world that we have in all of us, in this complex his complex theory on the conscious and the unconscious, and how those events um, kind of manifest in how our personalities develop, and how we can bring our conscious and our unconscious into our conscious, and the study of dreams, and all of that kind of thing. But Carl Jung also develops a theory into the unconscious, and that um, he lays the groundwork of these. He looks at universal patterns and how those universal patterns manifest themselves in dreams, visions, fantasies, and how they're expressed in myths, religious concepts, fairy tales, works of art, all those types of things. But the psychological innovations and the politics and economy, which we'll talk about more in just a second, really transformed the way the modern man looked at himself and the world in which he lived. And we get a society that is uh, it sees the world very differently, and not necessarily always in a positive kind of optimistic light. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to talk about um, the Great War a little bit, and then I'm going to segue into our focal author of the week. So stay tuned.